How's it going, everyone? Deja Brew here, lead analyst and founder of the Oasis Trading Group. In this video, I'm going to be going over the Oasis Trading Suite indicator. I'm going to be telling you guys what it does and giving you guys some tips and tricks on how to use it. Okay, let's get started. So, first off, the candle colors will override your current candle colors, and it will give you green candles for when it is in a bullish trend, red candles when it's in a bearish trend, and gray candles when it is in a neutral or there is no trend. So a little tip here is go into your settings, and if you have a white background, I recommend making your borders both black. And then if you have a darker background, you would just have to pick a color that you would like that would come up easier on your chart. So maybe a white border color, or maybe you want to do green or red, but make sure the border colors are the same, because if you don't do that, let's for example show you if I have green here and then red here, it will make the candles look all weird because the borders will be based on what the candle is in Tradingview and not what the OTS is coding it. So to make your chart look really clean, I highly recommend making your border colors black for a white background, and then find a color that you like for a darker background. Another tip before we get started is make sure to right click on your scale and use scale price chart only. If you don't turn this on, it will start scaling it based on where the pivots are on your chart, and sometimes this will squish your chart down to a very small margin. So make sure you right click, scale price chart only. All right, so let's get started. So after you already know what the colors are, let's go into the pivots. So the pivots are support and resistance levels that the OTS provides you, but they're more than that. They're more of a zone of influence. They give you kind of these magnet zones that like to attract price into them. So you can use these as targets, you can use them as entry levels, but more often you can use them just as basic support and resistance levels. So I'm going to show you a bunch of examples throughout this video on how to use these pivots, and I will get to that in a little bit. Let's get started with the trail before I move into that. So the trail is used the same way that you would use a moving average. So it's going to follow price just as if it was a moving average. But one thing that it does that a moving average doesn't do is it gives you a little indication on whether if it's downtrending or uptrending. So if it is entering a bearish trend, it will go from green to red. If it's entering a bullish trend, it will go from red to green. Another thing that the trail does is it will give you buy the dip and sell the rally signals. So if you're in a strong trend, these would give you kind of re-entry points, or maybe you missed the initial trend flip and you're looking for a late exit, or excuse me, a late entry. These buy the dip or sell the rally signals will give you that late entry. So I recommend, if your trend is very strong, to pay very close attention to these signals. But if you're in a sideways market, these signals will fake you out sometimes. So be careful on that. Something kind of like this. But if you are trending very heavily, these signals will give you very good entries for those late signals. All right, so let me show you guys some really good examples on how to use this indicator. So while we're on ES, you can see these pivots sometimes will look like they're in the middle of nowhere, but always understand that these pivots will be respected for the most part, no matter where they are, no matter how old they are. For the most part, these pivots will be respected. And you can see that even if you extend these pivots for a very long time, like this pivot was created in December of 2019, and then if we zoom out, it didn't really respect it to a T right here, but it did show you some resistance. But look at how it respects it here and here. Almost perfect bounces off of that pivot. So not only can the orange pivots be resistance, they can also be support. Okay, so the orange pivots will only form on a move up. So it has to be an uptrend to form an orange pivot, but it doesn't have to be a resistance at all times. Once you break that orange pivot to the upside, that orange pivot will become a support. Okay, same thing with the blue pivots. They're not always going to be supports. They can also be resistance. So like if we look at something like this, once that blue pivot has been broken, you can see how price is retesting it as a resistance, and then you go lower. Okay, so the blue pivots will be formed on downtrends, but they will not always be support. It's always about where your price is relative to that pivot. Okay, so let's go into a few examples of how you could have used these pivots. So on the weekly, you can see that some pivots will turn off and they'll be short-lived. That's because in the code, these pivots will turn off once a new pivot is formed, so that these pivots aren't just clogging up your chart with every single level. So in the code, they will turn off once a new one is formed. That does not mean that that pivot is dead. That's just a visual thing to help you on your chart. But if you go back to older pivots and you go ahead and extend those with a ray or a horizontal line, you can see that even really old pivots can act as support. Take the coronavirus nuke for an example. This pivot was created back in 2016, so almost 4 years in advance, and that called the bottom almost to the tick on that coronavirus low. You tried to find support on that initial bounce. Let me zoom in. You can see that you had that initial bounce on that pivot there, and then that secondary pivot right down here at 2175 actually ended up being the support. So these pivots can act as support or resistance even if they're very old. So keep that in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is when these pivots are formed, so like right here, this would have waited. So once this started to bounce, let's say it started to bounce around 2300, that probably would have triggered the pivot to turn on. But that pivot will not finish unless that candle closes, okay? So let's say we started to bounce around 2300, but then it started to nuke. Maybe that would have turned on the pivot, but then the candle did not close like that, so it could have turned off if it did go down. So always wait for the candle to close if you are looking at a pivot. You want to make sure that it is a confirmed pivot before you use it for confirmation, okay? So when that pivot is confirmed, if it's a blue pivot, it will confirm on the low of the candle. If it's an orange pivot, it will confirm on the high of the candle, okay? So let's go over a few examples here. Move on to Tesla. So another thing that these pivots will do is they need the market to be kind of inefficient to create these pivots, okay? If the market is very efficient and it's creating a very efficient trend either to the upside or downside, it will not create pivots, okay? So like Tesla weekly is a good example of this. This looks like a very ridiculous trend to the upside, but according to the OTS, this is a very efficient uptrend because you are not putting in any pivots to the top side or the low side, okay? This is being a very efficient trend all the way up. And you could see that with the OTS. We turned green way back here around like $60, and you basically never turned off. You had a couple areas where it turned gray, but you were basically green all the way up. So that was telling you that your trend was very bullish the entire way up, okay? So the OTS tries to keep you in the trend as long as it possibly can. It does that by coloring your candles and also giving you that trail. So if you do pull back and it maintains that bullish trail, let me actually make this a little easier to see. If that pullback does maintain a bullish trail, this could give you like a trap signal, okay? So if the price is breaking that trail and then reclaiming it, as long as your OTS did not flip bearish, so you see how the candles did not flip bearish here, or the trail, they both remained bullish. Once it reclaimed that trail, this is kind of giving you a bear trap. So the bears are being trapped, and then the trend is continuing bullishly. So this would have told you to basically never get out of Tesla all the way from $60, okay? Now, another thing I wanted to go over with this Tesla chart is because you are not creating any new pivots, these older pivots will be very long pivots. So they will be very long-lived pivots. And that's just telling you that there are no new pivots being created, okay? So this would be the weekly. Let's go down to the daily, and kind of the same thing is happening. So because this uptrend is so strong, it is not giving the OTS an opportunity to put in a blue pivot. The blue pivots can only be formed on downtrends, okay? And they have to be downtrends where, let's say, the bulls are becoming inefficient and they are losing, they're pivoting to the, the bears are pivoting to the bullish side, okay? That is what creates the pivots. When the price is trending in one direction, but they're becoming inefficient and they're pivoting off of that trend. So if the trend remains very efficient, you will not create those blue pivots. This is kind of telling you that this trend is very bullish because you are not putting in any blue pivots. You're only putting in the orange pivots, okay? So if I zoom in here, I wanted to show you one more level before we go to other tickers. Understand that these levels are extremely strong when being retested, okay? So no matter where they are, they might look like they're in the middle of nowhere, but when they are being retested, they are extremely strong and they will cause bounces more often than not, okay? So when you have a pivot being put in something like this, and we have that breakout of that pivot, that creates a very strong breakout point because you are breaking that resistance, okay? So now that you broke that resistance is now becoming support, okay? So now that this orange pivot is broken, when you come back to retest it, it should act as support, okay? And look at what happens here with that orange pivot. Bounce, bounce, bounce. You bounced like 4 times here, and then you ended up going higher. So now look at this orange pivot moving forward. Kind of hard to see because Tesla goes vertical. But look at how this orange pivot comes in. Retest, retest, retest. You're failing all the way through this pivot. And then you go back to retest these older pivots. And then look at what price does. You bounce perfectly off of these levels. Okay. Now, this is something you really want to pay attention to on the OTS. If you have multiple pivots in the same area, especially if they're different colors, like this one has an orange pivot and a blue pivot in the same area, that is a very big zone of influence, okay? So if price is above that zone, that is going to be a very major support. If price is below that zone, that is going to be a very major resistance, okay? So if you have multiple pivots that are in the same area, especially if they're different colors, you really want to pay attention to how price is reacting to that area, okay? Another thing you want to pay attention to is when you are putting in those secondary pivots. So when we have that pivot already in that area, and then you're putting in that second pivot, that is a very good opportunity to take that trade in whichever direction the price begins to push off of the pivots. So right here, the price is pushing off the pivots to the upside. That gives you a very good opportunity to hop in that trade bullishly, because it's kind of the same mentality as like a double bottom. You have a pivot there. Now we have another pivot, so it's giving you kind of a double bottom zone of influence. So you could take that trade once you push off of it bullishly, and then your stop loss would be below that zone of influence. Okay. So another trick here with the pivots, as I said earlier back here, they can be used as breakout points as well as targets. So watch this level here. See this level on Tesla? See how you're resisting it constantly? And then look at what happens when you break it. You break above that level and you close above that level, and then look at what it does. It just absolutely tears through that level. So once these levels, these pivots have been broken, that gives you very good breakout trades as well. So another example that I wanted to show you, move on to NEO. This is what we call a bullish ladder setup on the pivots. So when you're in a strong uptrend and you put in these pivots on your high points, and then you begin to consolidate under these pivots, this is creating kind of like a bull flag pattern, right? Where you break out, put in a pivot, and then you kind of consolidate below that pivot. So when you break out above it, just as I said with Tesla, this becomes a very good breakout trade. And when you come back to retest that level, it should be support, right? So let's look at what NEO did. You see how Neo, it pushes higher. So let's see all the way back from the bottom. You go red to green. So your trend goes from bearish to bullish. And then you break a key pivot here. And you start to push higher with your trail right below you. So it's pushing you up. And then what does Neo do all the way up? We have a pivot being put in on a high. You break the pivot. Retest it. You get a little bit of a fake out. But retested it. Acted as support. Consolidate. Break higher. And now let's keep going. What does it do? Puts in another pivot. Consolidates. Breaks it. Retests it. So another support comes in. Same thing here. Another pivot. Consolidates below it. Look at the trail. The trail is remaining bullish all the way up. So it's kind of pushing price all the way up into the pivots. Okay. Keep going. What does it do? Pivot, consolidate, break. Pivot, consolidate, break. All the way up. And then now we're finally getting out of that trend. Because the trend is becoming a lot more volatile than it was going all the way up. Notice another thing here. What happens to the trend once these pivots start to come in? The consolidation points get smaller and smaller. And then now we're not getting that clean price action because the volatility is much higher. Okay, so it's not giving you that smooth price action. But this is what we would call a bullish ladder pattern, putting in kind of that stair-stepping pattern all the way up. I'm going to also show you a bearish ladder as well. Let's take a look at a bearish ladder. So this will be gold 4 hour. So same exact system, but with the blue pivots. Okay. So if you are putting in a nice downtrend and you're putting in these pivots and you're trying to bounce off of these pivots, but then you're breaking them, these are giving you kind of continuation signals. Okay. So this would be a continuation signal to the downside. This would be a continuation signal to the downside, so on and so forth. You're putting in the blue pivot and then you're breaking it to the downside. So that's giving you your bearish ladder pattern. And then finally, look at what happens down here. You put in a blue pivot, so you're anticipating, okay, maybe we bounce a little bit and then we fail the pivot, right? But that doesn't happen here. Look at what it does. It puts in a blue pivot. You turn red to green on the OTS. Notice how you almost never, except for this little trap here, we'll go over that in a second, you almost never turn red to green. So you finally turn red to green. You could wait for the trail to give you confirmation, which it did here. You have red to green on the candle colors, and then you also have red to green on the trail. So this is a very bullish trend flip. This would be a very strong momentum flip from the bear side to the bull side. You're getting that blue pivot, which is kind of confirming the bottom. You have your secondary confirmation with the candle colors, and then you have your final confirmation with the trail flipping green. Okay? So one more thing I wanted to go over here before we move on. This is what would be considered a trap, where you have the OTS going from red to green, but then it doesn't flip the trail. Okay? You only go red to green for a few candles, and then you get sell signals on the trail, and then it nukes. So this would be a trap. If there's ever a time where you are still in a strong downtrend and you try to push higher, but it only gives you a couple green candles and then you flip back to red, that is a bearish continuation pattern. The same thing can be said for the red side as well. If you have an uptrend that goes from green to red, or excuse me, red to green, and then you put in only one or a couple red candles, but they do not break that trail, or they do break the trail, but then it recovers, that creates a trap. Okay, so this would be a bear trap, and this would be a bull trap. The bulls are being trapped here, and the bears are being trapped here. In a perfect world, the OTS trail will give you signals letting you know that this is trapping, but sometimes this will happen when the price is not perfectly testing the trail. So you won't always get those arrow signals to let you know that it's trapping. All right, moving on to a few other examples here. Show you Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a good example of using the extended pivots as well. So, as I said earlier, some of these pivots, like take this one for example, this pivot looks like it's in the middle of nowhere, right? And you're not getting any price action to come test that pivot. So it doesn't look like it's a very strong pivot. But let's extend this pivot and see how it reacts. We extend this pivot. It takes forever for the price to come back and retest that pivot. But look at what it does when it does retest that pivot. This is, let's see, nearly 2 years, 530 days it takes to retest that pivot. But when it finally does retest that pivot, it almost calls the high of 2019 to the dollar. Okay, so understand that those pivots, even if they're in very weird places, even if they're very short, you can extend those pivots and they will very often get very strong price action when they are retested. Okay. The daily on Bitcoin is also good examples of using these as not only support, but resistance as well. So you can see how it acts as support and then it also acts as resistance. So don't let the colors fool you. The orange pivots can also be very good support, and the blue pivots can also be very strong resistance. Okay. A couple more levels I wanted to show you here. The weekly levels on Bitcoin also had very strong reactions. You had this weekly level basically call the all-time high, which it didn't call it exactly because, like I told you earlier, this pivot would not have started to form until price started to pivot off of that level. These levels will never repaint, but they will take a little confirmation to start filling in. So price was probably somewhere around here once that pivot started to come in. And then once that candle closes, that pivot gets locked in. Okay. Once that pivot is locked in, it will never move. If it moves, that's a TradingView bug because there is nothing in the code that will allow these pivots to move. Sometimes I get a lot of messages where people think they moved, but they will be turning on extended hours, and then they realize that the pivots are different from extended hours to live trading hours. Okay. I recommend using live trading hours. I do not use extended hours for my pivots. But let's go back to what I was saying. So this pivot would be put in once this candle closes, and then you could zoom out here, and you can see that they act as magnets. So if, for example, let's say we took this breakout trade. Let's just say we went long right here. And people are always asking me, okay, like, what do you target? Where are your targets? And very often in most of my trades, I am targeting the pivots. So if there are pivots above me or below me, that is what I'm targeting. So even if I took the long right here, and that seems like a very far away target, because there are no targets in between, that is my target. Okay. Now, the only thing that I would target in between is, since this is a weekly, maybe we go down to a daily and we see if there's any pivots in between our entry and where that was. So there's only one daily pivot on Bitcoin. So we could grab this level here, go back to the weekly, and that is not going to give us a target because that is where we entered. Okay. So our only target is that weekly pivot. And these will act as magnets, just as, if you guys are familiar with volume profile, high volume nodes typically act as magnets. That is kind of similar to what the pivots will do. Okay. So look at the blue pivot here as another great example as a magnet. You have this very strong uptrend, right? But you're not putting in any blue pivots on the way up because the trend is very efficient. Okay. It's a very strong, bullish, efficient trend. So we leave this blue pivot all the way down on the bottom, and this is what I would consider a naked pivot. So once again, if you guys are familiar with volume profile, a naked POC is a point of control that has not been tested, right? Same theory behind the naked pivots. A naked pivot is a pivot that has not been tested, okay? So naked pivots will be very strong because they have not been tested before. So that is a support that has not been tested, okay? So if you're, let's say we take the break of this pivot bearishly as our entry, what are we targeting? We're targeting previous pivots, okay? So we can go ahead and we can extend some of these pivots, and these would be our targets, right? But we also understand that these pivots have already been tested. Okay, price action has already tested these pivots. So the only pivot below us that is naked, that has not been tested, is this one. So that would be the strongest target below our entry. Okay. So you could target these levels. Maybe you take some profit there. Maybe you take some profit there. But this should be your final target. And then let's say that is our final target. And then price begins to bounce a little early. We probably should close our position right there, because you are bouncing off a previous pivot, and that pivot is going to be very strong support. Okay. A couple more examples I want to show you guys before we end the video. Monthly on Bitcoin is another great example of a pivot that was naked and it acted as a very strong pivot. Okay. So you had a pivot be put in right around the all-time high candle. This was the candle after the all-time high, so the month after. It puts in that pivot as price is pivoting off that level. And this becomes a naked pivot where you don't have any price action testing that pivot all the way until that wick there. So look at how price reacted to that pivot once it tested it. It gave you a beautiful reaction because that was the first test of that pivot. Okay? So naked pivots will act as very strong levels for price action. That can be for targets, that can be for entries. So like, for example, right here, I called this out in Discord. If you guys remember, I said once that monthly pivot breaks, Bitcoin should skyrocket because that monthly pivot has never been broken. So you had that retest here, and then you had that break there. So this would have been a very strong entry for that bullish trade. Okay. Another good example about the monthly here on Bitcoin is look at what happens when you zoom out and you look at this as a whole. You had your green uptrend, and it kept you in this trend as long as it possibly could. And then once that pivot came in, that was a really good point to be like, okay, maybe I should start taking profit. Okay? Because the pivot is telling you that the bulls are losing efficiency. They are not as efficient as they were back here. They are pivoting to the downside. Okay? So if you were long on Bitcoin, like let's say from here, you could have taken a lot of profit once that pivot got put in. You would have given up a lot of profit, obviously, because this is a monthly time frame. But that gave you a really good opportunity to get out of that trade. Okay. And then also an alert on this would have been the green to gray. That is telling you that the bullish trend is now shifting into a neutral trend. And then it shifted into a bearish trend, but that trend was very short-lived. So once you turned red to green again, and then you had the confirmation on the OTS trail, this was telling you that your trend was very bullish. You had that nasty sell-off here in March, but look at what happened. You wicked all the way down below that trail, and then you got bought all the way back up. If this would have closed just a little bit higher, this would have actually given you a buy signal on the trail. For the buy signals or the sell signals, it's based on wicks. So if a wick goes through that trail, and then it comes all the way back up, that will give you a buy signal. Okay. Same thing for the sell arrows. It has to wick the trail and then close below it, and that will give you a sell arrow. Okay. I think we have one more example to go over, and then I'm going to end the video. I wanted to show you guys one forex example. So this is a good example of not only the OTS trail, but also the pivots. So you have the pivots acting as beautiful support here. And this is the example that I kind of wanted to go over. This is a little signal. We zoom into this. So when you see stuff like this happen, this becomes like a swing failure. Okay. So if you have a pivot and then price kind of breaks the pivot a little bit, but then reclaims it, this gives you a very good entry once it reclaims that pivot. Now, if you wanted to wait for confirmation, you want to wait for your OTS to turn green and your trail to turn green. And that will confirm that the bears here are being trapped. The bears that push the price below the pivot are now being trapped because you are entering an uptrend. Okay? So same would be said for a bearish pivot. So if you had an orange pivot and then price broke above it and then went below it, once you turn from green to red on the OTS candle colors and the trail, that lets you know that all the bulls right here are being trapped. Okay. One more thing I wanted to show you here is when it does this, when it colors your candles like all orange, this is just because there's no volume data. If there's no volume data, it cannot give you the proper candle colors or the proper pivots. Okay, so if your chart looks like this, it's because there is not sufficient volume data. Right. Finally, I just wanted to show you guys how clean the trail is on a very strong trend. When you have very strong trends, bullishly or bearishly, the trail will give you kind of the idea of when that trend is shifting. Okay, you can see how you went from kind of a downtrend accumulation into an uptrend, into a downtrend, back into an uptrend. Okay. Finally, I wanted to show you guys how to set alerts for the OTS. So if we go to the alerts, you can go to the Oasis Trading Suite, and we have a bunch of alerts here. Bearish trail flip is when it goes from red to green to red, excuse me. That would be the bearish trail flip. When it goes from red to green, that would be a bullish trail flip. Green to red would be a bearish trail flip. Buy the dip would be the blue arrows. Sell the rally would be the orange arrows. New bearish trend is when the candle colors turn red. New bullish trend is when the candle colors turn green. New pivot high is when an orange pivot is made. New pivot low is when a blue pivot is made. Okay? Those are all the alerts. That's it for the video, guys. If you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments below or send me a message on Discord. To get access to this indicator, just go to oasistrading.io and check out our indicator section. If you guys like this video, make sure to like the video, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.